Hello, everyone. It's Sunday afternoon. It's been a long week, and what a fabulous way to end it. As the final talk in our slate of programming, this is really an incredible honor to present this. My name is Lydia Malamed Johnson. I'm the executive director of APAD and the Photography Show, and we are really, as I said, honored to present this incredible panel of women to talk about Japanese women and their indelible mark on the history of photography. So I'm gonna just hand it right off to Miwa, but I wanna thank you all for coming here to hear about this important project and hope you'll enjoy the fair after. I know the book is also available at Aperture and in the drill hall. So thank you very much and please enjoy.
We don't have a copy of the book. That's so funny. We're gonna see it.
So thank you very much for joining today. I'm so excited to introduce our panel. And then thank you, Pauline and then Lesley, to making this fantastic publication. As a Japanese publisher, photobook consultant at the Dashwood book, I am happy to see this publication. So why don't I just jump into like an overview of this publication, Pauline, and then Lesley, would you start sharing with us genesis of the publication, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you everyone for joining. Thanks everyone who's here. I will start out. I'm Lesley Martin. I'm now the executive director at Printed Matter. This was one of the last projects that I was able to fulfill in my role as creative director at Aperture. And it would not have happened without the collaborative ethos that is represented here on the couch. Pauline and I are the editors of this book, but we also had an editorial committee who really helped us to excavate all of these amazing histories, stories that had not been gathered together, but had been pursued and cultivated and nurtured by galleries, by historians. So this is the book, and as mentioned, it is at Aperture. I guess, Pauline, you and I can talk about it, and we'll also very glad to have Russet, who is one of the contributors here for the illustrated bibliography, and Sayaka and Miwa, who are both advisors behind the scenes and especially working directly with some of the photographers. We were very glad to have Sayaka's help. The title of the book, Pauline, do you want to talk about this?
Yes, yes, thank you, Lesley. So I'm Pauline Vermare. I'm one of the co-editors of the book, and it's a pleasure to talk about the book here and the project in general. The book also became an exhibition. We'll talk a little bit about that. But so the process and the title, first, I'm so happy you are here, came from a poem by one of the photographers included in the book, Kawauchi Rinko. Once in a while, we should look into each other's eyes, otherwise we might feel lost. I'm so glad that you are here. That we thought was a beautiful poem. That was from the book, The Eyes, the Ears, that's photography and poetry. And when we were looking, so we had the subtitle, Japanese Women Photographers, but we thought perhaps we needed a title to encapsulate the feeling that we felt working on this book, working on this project, seeing the work, sharing the work, and yeah, so we were very much inspired by this, by the words of Kawauchi.
And maybe we can just tell you a little bit about the structure of the book, because Pauline and I both come from different entry points to this topic. Pauline, yes, you could maybe speak to
how I came in. Yes. So why did we do the book? The genesis of the thought of making the book. Lesley and I came from our own experiences. Mine being that I grew up in Japan. I'm French, but I grew up in Japan, but I'd never really looked into the history of Japanese photography for quite a few reasons. I was working a lot with Cartier-Bresson, Kappa, European archives from the 30s to the 60s, 70s, essentially, until Luce Lebar and Marie Robert invited me to participate in this book, A World History of Women Photographers, that was in 2019, and they invited hundreds of us to contribute, and spontaneously I suggested writing about a few Japanese women, including Tokiwa and others. And after this book came out, which was really in France a very important publication, maybe more so than here, for cultural reasons, we really were very late in the discovery of French, of women photographers. But so the Maison Européenne de la Photographie asked me at that moment to do a masterclass on Japanese women photographers. It was COVID, it was online. And preparing this, and Russet was essential in helping me with this research through the books made by women photographers, Japanese women photographers. It occurred to me that we historians of photography included in the West, meaning mostly the countries I know best, France and America, we really knew very little about the history of Japanese women photographers. We maybe knew of handful, the lucky bunch of us who had seen the shows at the Getty and other places, knew about Ishiuchi and others, but really we barely knew them. And so when I finished preparing that PowerPoint for the masterclass, I thought it would be important to have a book so that it stays, and that book should be, and Lesley was instrumental in the structure of it, what does it look like? It's not an encyclopedia, it's something that's very much alive. It includes, of course, the books, and that's where Russet and Mark Feusel were instrumental. And so that's where I came from. And then Lesley and I spoke about it.
Yeah, and just my background, I had actually spent some time in Japan in the early 90s and came to know photography and Aperture was able to continue working with artists like Hosoe Eiko, Homa Takashi, but also worked very closely with Kauichi Rinko, was very interested in starting to explore the way in which women had depicted their own selves, their body, had the opportunity to reconnect with Nagashima Yurie, who has thought very deeply about this. So we both had some points of interest. I had actually started thinking primarily about the 1990s, which was a watershed moment in the history of Japanese society, really, because of the shifts of laws in the 1980s that made equal opportunity, more opportunity for women to be paid the same as men, which led to many more Japanese women going to school, taking on different practices. I'll just skip through to some of these slides. What we decided we really wanted to do was to make something bigger than just this one moment, because in fact, to tell the story of one decade when the history itself hadn't really been explored seemed very important. So we had many, many ideas. We boiled it down to being able to feature 25 photographers with a portfolio, which you'll see if you pick up the book, and then essays by a number of people, such as Pauline, Carrie Cushman, and Kelly Midori McCormick, who are also part of the editorial committee, and had started this amazing resource, Behind the Camera, which is online and available. They're really historians of Japanese photography, Japanese society, and came with a very particular agenda, I think driven by their own interest in feminism. Mariko Takeuchi, who is a professor, curator, and writer. She has this amazing book, Silence and Image, which is a collection of her writing about Japanese photography, bilingual. And then we knew that you cannot tell the history of Japanese photography in any way without dealing with the books, because the role of the book has such an important way of interacting and moving work forward into the world. So Mark Feusel and Russet Lederman put this together. We also knew that we were not inventing this study on our own, that there were many who had written about it in different corners, and that we wanted to present a series of writings about the early, that goes all the way back, in fact, to the Meiji era, and thinking about studios and women in the studios. So it's a very comprehensive resource. I think that was the main goal.
Right, we wanted it to be comprehensive and also to include as many voices from Japan as possible, hence those selected essays, and to show how many people, how many historians, curators, and photographers, of course, had been thinking about the question for many decades. It was important to state that also this was not out of the blue. This was something that we decided to compile into a book so that it stays to be available for further research. Yes, and then the book, this is the French version of the book published by Textuel. You can see very different cover. I love how different the books are. They're like two different books, really. The title is just Japanese Women Photographers from the 50s to today. And this accompanied the show in Arles, which was presented, this is the show, co-curated with Mariko Takeuchi, who we just talked about, also part of the editorial committee. And so this was quite a wonderful moment because this was a moment when many of the photographers were here. We were able to talk about it in public. We had many talks and events, and it was quite a joyful moment and a celebration of the book and the show is traveling now. I don't know if that's the next slides, but yes, it went to Den Haag, in the Netherlands, and it's next going to Frankfurt, opening in a few days, in a week or so.
The end of May.
Yeah, the end of May.
Before coming to the US, we'll be happy to have the show at the ICP in 2026. So that's sort of our gallop through, just so you have a sense of the overview. And I think, Miwa, if there are the next.
It's a pretty comprehensive, and then I really have to recommend all of you to buy this book because, as they explain, it's got a lot of historical overview of the female photographer from Japan from the 60s up till now, and then it's got a lot of essay from a Japanese scholar. I highly recommend that you get this book. So I want to move to a Russet, if that's okay. Russet, I love your selection.
Okay.
I think that one of my favorite part of your
Black one.
book is that your selection of the Japanese female photographers book. Thank you very much for working for this. Your contribution is tremendous. So, Russet, first of all, I really need to ask you, tell me about that photo book in Japan.
Okay.
So how important is that?
Okay. Thank you, Miwa, Leslie, Pauline, for inviting me to participate on this project. And Sayaka, I've admired her work in her gallery in Tokyo for many, many years. So I'm Russet Lederman. I am a writer, a collector of photo books, as well as running an organization called 10 by 10 Photo Books, which is a nonprofit that supports research in marginalized or underrepresented areas of photography publishing. And photography publishing is a very short history. It's probably from like the mid-90s onward, but we still have a lot of work to do. And basically, I come to Japanese books from this history of collecting them. And that really started for me in 2000. I have to credit Andrew Roth, who handed my husband a book, and there was no turning back at that point. But I was shocked in those early years that when we first started collecting that most of the books that we were looking at were by men. And there really were not that many books that we saw here in the US that were by women. And as we all know, the book is a primary format for Japanese photographers to share their work. So the question always kind of stuck with me, where are the women? So we started to see, of course, the more contemporary women like Shiga Rieko or Hara Mikiko or Kauichi Rinko. But my question was, what about the earlier women? And these guys, by pairing me with Mark Fustel, who is a historian and writer in Paris, was brilliant because Mark's focus is more on contemporary. And my focus for the illustrated bibliography that is in I'm So Happy You Are Here is more on the historical works. So in 2018, I have to say my colleague with 10 by 10 and I did a book on photo books by women in anthology. And it introduced me to some of the more historical photo books by women. And why don't we go, we went to the next slide, thank you. What kind of shocked me was that the very first book by a woman that we document in I'm So Happy You Are Here is from 1957. It's by Tokiwa Toyoko. And so I was wondering, well, were there books before that? Why was 1957 when there were so many women in the West who were active publishing books? in Japan. And so I think we have to look a little further back at some of the examples that might not be conclusive examples of a book as we think of it by Japanese women, but certainly help us understand kind of a foundation. And so here on the slide, we see Shima Ryu, who did this album in the 1860s with her husband, Shima Kakaku. And they did 2 albums, and it's well documented in Japanese photo history and photo book history. But it is inconclusive whether she contributed to the book. They ran a studio in Gunma together, but most Japanese historians tell me, yes, they did collaborate together. So there are these examples early on of Japanese women in
And we can say that Shima Ryu is often considered the first active woman photographer whose work is known to history.
Yeah, in Japan. She is definitely held up as the first woman photographer in the 1860s. But where we see Japanese women publishing is in the magazines. And so I just wanted to show you one example of a magazine of Yamawaki Michiko, who with her husband went to the Bauhaus. And this is an article that photographs that she included in Asahi's camera in August 1933, and it is a montage, a collage. So these are kind of some of the roots. They're not books, but this is where the books kind of come from. So the very first book by a Japanese woman photographer is in 1957, and it is by Tokiwa Chiyoko, and it is called Kiken na Adobana, which has various translations. Here we're translating it as Dangerous Poison Flowers. And this is really an interesting book because it is kind of the reverse example. She had an exhibition first, and then the book happened later on. Usually in Japan, there is a book, and then exhibitions happen. But this very small-scale book, she was photographing working women in the port city of Yokohama, and many of them were sex workers. And she was photographing them from 1954 to 1956, and this was just before the enactment of an anti-prostitution law that was fully enforced in 1958. And in the beginning, she was quite timid. She was holding her camera in the folds of her clothing, and then by the end, she was quite brazen in photographing them. She doesn't just photograph sex workers, she also photographs women who work in shops as well, and she also photographs herself. On the cover, you can see her holding the camera to her eye with what is shown in the lens of a woman being dragged quite aggressively. So she then later, earlier had a show that was in Tokyo, and this book came out before that show. Her show was in 1956 at Konishi Ruku Gallery in Tokyo's Ginza district, and she received so much attention that this book went into 15 reprints in its first year of release. So I'm going to just show you a few people, and they're going to be historical, given my particular area of interest. This is a real favorite of mine. This is Yamazawa Eiko. This book, Enkin, Far and Near, I love it because it traces her historic journey. She, like a number of Japanese women photographers, came to the US to study. She came to San Francisco in 1926, and she studied at the Art Institute there. And through a camera shop owner, she was introduced to Consuelo Kanaga and was able to work for her as a studio assistant. And so she returned to Osaka, opened up a studio there, mentored a lot of women in her studio. But I love this book because her early work is portraiture, black and white for the most part. And then later on, she began to experiment when she closed up her studio with these abstractions that were very brightly colored and really, quite creative. And so this book for me is quite important because it shows that kind of trajectory for her as a photographer. And that is a photograph of Consuelo Kanaga, which, in honor of Pauline, who has a show at the Brooklyn Museum.
I should say, yeah, this photo it's included in the show at the Brooklyn Museum.
So,
she comes here.
so I felt that we needed to tie it back to New York and to Pauline as well. So, okay, and then Another one is Nishimura Tomiko, who had a show here in New York recently at Alison Bradley's gallery. And she photographed on a road trip. She graduated from Tokyo College of Photography, started to take on odd jobs working for magazines. And when she had free time, she would travel by train or bus. And it was during the time that the Japan Railway had a promotional campaign that women could travel quite easily. And so she was traveling solo, quite unusual at the time, and photographing from train windows and bus windows, as well as on the streets. And this book is called Shikishima, which is a kind of traditional name in Japanese poetry, an ancient name for Japan, used in Japanese poetry. So this book is from like the 1970s onward, I believe, that these photographs came. And I'm going to skip quickly because we have 45 minutes and there's time for, but I'm going to move on to Matsumoto Michiko, who did this book, and I chose it. It's called Women Come Alive, because it really touches upon the Uman Ribu, or the feminism within Japan, and which is quite different than in the US. And she photographed a lot of the women who went to rallies and protests, and she also documented second wave feminism in the US as well. And basically, it kind of looks at the movement as it happened. And I think that is it. We're going to move on to, I just wanted to show you a few so that you had a sense of this kind of early examples of photography publishing by women.
So next question going to Sayaka. So good to see you in New York.
Yeah.
How are you doing? We met in Tokyo for over Italian lunch. Remember? Okay, Sayaka. So my first question is that what kind of a challenge that the Japanese female photographer have to go through to establish their career? You work with like artists through your gallery, so you might witness that a lot of challenges that they have to go through. So would you please tell me your thoughts?
So, thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me to be on this talk. And I'm Sayaka Takahashi, director of PGI Gallery in Tokyo. 今日は英語で話した方が本当は時間も短くなっていいのですが、日本の女性の写真家についてのお話なので母国語で話したいと思います。
So I'm translating the Japanese part. I understand that it will be faster and easier if I just speak in English, but today, because I'm talking about Japanese female photographers, I decided it might be best to speak in my native language, Japanese.
このことを受け入れてくださった APAT の、皆さんと今日一緒に登壇してくれている皆さんに感謝申し上げます。また、通訳を引き受けてくださっている柴雅子さんはニューヨークで美術の世界で活躍する女性の一人です。雅子さんのような経験も知識も豊富な方に通訳していただけることはありがたく思います。
Okay. Well, first, she's very grateful for this opportunity and for APAD, of course, and for the wonderful panelists here today to be speaking with them. And I'm doing a little weird thing as a translator, but she also gave thanks to me as a translator, acknowledging that I am someone active in the New York art scene as well. So thank you, thank you.
質問にお答えします。そもそもまず、日本には、サスティナブルなマーケットがないので、女性男性っていう性別を問わず写真家としてとかアーティストとして生きていくことはとても難しいことです。
So first and foremost, there is no sustainable market in Japan for artists to kind of work, and that doesn't depend on like gender or anything. It's just very tough to be an artist and make a living.
でその上で振り返ると、美術館などのインスティテューションの収蔵において女性作家の割合が男性に比べてとても少ないです。
And also considering that when you look at museum acquisitions and collections, female artists being in the collection is a very rare thing. It's much less than male artists.
おそらく日本だけではなくて世界でも同じ状況だとは思います。
I'm sure that's not just the case of Japan.
で日本では今、各美術館が、女性に対しての予算を設けて、開館当初に振り返って歴史を振り返りながら収集し直している状況です。
So what's happening at museums in Japan is that they're looking back to the start of their acquisition in history and seeing if they are missing opportunities to collect properly Japanese female artists.
例えば今年は東京都の写真美術館が開館30周年です。で元チーフキュレーターの笠原美智子さんが、フェミニズムを掲げてくださっていたので定期的にジェンダーをテーマにした展覧会が開催されていたんですけれどもということもあってコンテンポラリーの女性作家の活躍はフォローされているけれども、開館当初のまとまったアクイジションはほとんど男性でした。
So for instance, this year marks the 30th anniversary of Tokyo Photographic Art Museum, commonly known as TOP. And the former chief curator, Michiko Kasahara, she was really wonderful and really focusing on feminism during her time. And she constantly had exhibitions that featured gender as one of the themes. And so because of that, there are a lot of contemporary female photographers that have been showcased there. But what's happening is that they are recognizing how at the beginning of the acquisition history, there wasn't that much of that case.
今ちょうどここに写っているんですけれども潮田徳子さんの「マイ・ハズバンド」という作品がすごく明らかなんですけれども結婚とか出産それから両親の介護そういったことによってキャリアをストップせざるを得なかった女性作家も多くいます。
So as you can see, one of the examples that's shown on the screen, Ushioda, Tokuko Ushioda, a lot of the female photographers had to put their career on hold when they were giving birth, when they were getting married, or they had to do caretaking for their families, and that was a case that happened.
もう一つ、後で出てくる長島ゆりえさんともよく話すのですが、ゆりえ Yes. 彼女は特にフェミニストとしての役割を旗振り役として負わされて苦しむ場面があります。作品に制作することに集中したいけれどもどうしてもそれ以外のことを要求されるように感じて苦しんでいる。ゆりえさんのように一アーティストでありながらも生きること自体が作品になっている場合によくこうしたことがあります。
So another one is Yurie Nagashima, who's shown on the screen here. I talk to her a lot, but as a female artist, it's often the case that they almost expect you to be the feminist artist, and they kind of make you play that role, and you just want to be working on your work. But there's a lot of other things that are required, and especially happens with artists like Yurie, who kind of like her way of being, her life itself is her artist's practice. So that happens more when that's the case. One quick thing, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that the Shioda-san's work series title is My Husband. So that's also kind of important.
So, Pauline, do you have any question to Sayaka?
Not so much a question, but a great appreciation, first and foremost, because many of the photographers in the book we worked with through Sayaka, and we're very grateful. And PGI, the gallery, and Sayaka did incredible work all these years at promoting and showing the work of these women, and without that work, we would have not been able to do this project. But so, yes,
Thank you.
if I can ask you, thank you. And so then, yeah, maybe one question is, how did you see the evolution, maybe even recently? Do you feel like the things have been changing? And if so, how? For women photographers in Japan.
Okay. 日本 だと、1993年にパルコという会社があって、でそこが主催していたアーバナードっていうアワードがありました。でそこでこの長島ゆりえさんが受賞したこと、それから1995年にヒロミックスが、キャノンというカメラのメーカーがやっていたアワードでグランプリを受賞したりと、90年代から若い女性作家が若手のための写真賞に多く登場して女の子写真ブームが起こりました。
So in Japan, starting in like 1993, Parko, the department store, hosted a photography exhibition series called Urban Art. And Nagashima Yurie, who's on the screen, actually did win an award for that. 1995, Hiromixu won a grand prize actually at a photography award for Canon, the camera maker. So early, like from the 90s, I'd say young Japanese female photographers have started to receive awards and recognition. So the trend of girl photos have started back then.
でこのムーブメントについては2020年に当事者であるこの長島ゆりえさんが僕らの女の子写真から私たちのガーリーフォトへという本を出版していて、そのうちのチャプター8が I'm so happy you are here にも英語に訳されて掲載されています。
So, let's see. So once that kind of started about the boom, around 2020, I guess 2020, Yurie Nagashima actually wrote a book about this, and it's called Bokura no Nanoko Shashin. So that's their girls' photography to our girly photo. That's how it's translated in the book itself. But I do want to point out, Bokura actually refers to us guys. So it says more about us guys, what photography of girl photo is for us guys, moving to our girly photo as girls. And in chapter 8, it actually talks about I'm so happy you're here.
でこのガーリーフォトムーブメントっていうのは彼女たち自身によって作られたムーブメントというよりはマーケティング的な側面が強くて、当時の雑誌などによって作られた流行、ある意味メールゲーズによって作られたように感じられるものでした。
So this movement was a little bit more than the female photographers themselves doing it, but it was more a marketing aspect that was strong, and especially in the magazines now back then, and it was focused more kind of through the male gaze in terms of how the trend was being featured as.
それでも、彼女たちの活躍はそれ以降の世代の女性写真家の背中を強く押していましたし、私自身もいろいろな面においてこのことの影響を受けています。
But it is true that that movement itself has encouraged the next generation of female photographers to be active as well, and I myself have been influenced by that too.
でポーリーンの質問ですが、この「I'm so happy you are here」という本はすごく大きな意味があるし、将来は布石になっていくと思います。
So to respond to your question, Pauline, I do believe that this book, I'm So Happy You're Here, is very important, and it will become something crucial for the going forward.
美和さんともちょっとこのトークの前にお話をしていたのですが、90年代以前も以降もそんなに変化はなくて、ほとんど知られていないっていうのが実態で、むしろここ数年の第3波フェミニズムとか MeToo 運動というのが写真以外のところであって、日本に限らずさまざまなジェンダーにやっと光が当たってきた。 女性限らずさまざまなジェンダーに光が当たってきているように思っています。
So I talked to Miwa before this a little bit as well, but it doesn't change too much before or after the 90s, but it consistently remains the same, that it's not that known. But what is interesting is that recently, in the past few years, there's been like the third wave feminism or the Me Too movement. So, and because of that, there's been an impact in Japan as well. So it's not just Japan, but it's not just one gender, but a lot of diversity has been coming to the forefront, I feel.
おそらく私よりも海外での日本の写真の認知度っていうのはレスリーや美和さんのような方の方がこう体感されていると思うので、お二人の話を伺って美和さんの話特に伺ってみたいです。
So especially for these movements abroad, or how Japanese female photographers are being seen, I understand probably Lesley or Miwa, those who are active abroad, have a better grip of it. So I'm really excited to hear more about how you feel, especially Miwa-san.
Yeah, Leslie, don't you agree that we see like a more gender politics type of photo book, such as like Justin Cartland's Manifest, The Girl's Picture, or Carla Williams' Tender, and then My Birth by Carmen Winlet are all about like a gender concern, and I see that these things will continue more in the future. Yeah, I totally see that in the U.S. this kind of trend is strong and then clear.
And what we wanted with the book really was to have both. So it's a lot about gender and feminism, but we also wanted to insist on those other, sort of more universal issues of the history of photography and what have been omitted. And so we only have 4 minutes left.
Oh.
We'd love for Miwa to talk about 2 beautiful books that she published, one by Mao Ishikawa and one by Momo Okabe. If you don't mind, we can give you the, whatever this is called, I don't know. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
So let me explain the reason why I made a book with Mao Ishikawa. The reason why I made a book with Mao is that her original book wasn't her monograph. It was like collaboration with the other photographer. So I thought it was so important to make like her own photo book about Okinawa women. So that's one of the reasons why I approached Mao. And I also want to tell you that one of the subjects in her book was about to get married to a Japanese man, but her future in-law complained that she was sleeping with the American, and then they got upset, and then Mao needed to stop selling a book. So I felt that such a tragedy. So I decided to make a book with Mao, and I went to Okinawa and then stayed with her for 3 days. I had like a fancy appointment with the hotel, tried to do like a massage and a facial, but I have to cancel because Mao have to convince me like how important this project is about, and then she explained to me that how much she loves a woman in this book. So it was meaningful in 3 days, and then I had such a fun time working with Mao in Okinawa. That's my introduction for Mao Ishikawa. I also want to tell you about Momo Okabe. I noticed Momo Okabe is such a unique talent in Japan. Her color palette is so strong. It's about the LGBTQ community in Japan. And then, Pauline, you made like a fantastic exhibition 3 years ago in a Kyoto Graph. Thank you very much for introducing Momo for Japan. I think she's a very important voice in a community there, and then conservative organization like Kyoto Art Fair introduce her as a featured artist mean a lot to them. And your contribution is so huge there. So I also made a book with Momo that's called Dildo, and I hate this title. I don't like to pronounce the name of the book, but she insists that she wants to use this title for this publication. So I didn't have any choice, and then she's a unique person because she explained to me that she wants to raise the 2 kids, and then she chose the husband who can support her. She wants to stay home. She doesn't want to be like a full-time photographer. I have to suggest that in Japan, being a housewife, it's not always like a negative compared to a European or American woman. We have a different type of feminism, and I respect that all the women working home as a housewife, and then she's taking a picture, even she's raising 2 kids, and then I just want to tell you that her approach for photography, it's not always same as an American photographer. And then let's finish talking about my book and then move to a Q&A. Yes, thank you for listening. So thank you for coming here. And yes, please, yes.
Okay, so my question is, I have to say I'm a casual student of Japanese photography, let alone women photography. So I have to ask this question. So you have English edition of this book, French edition of this book. Is there going to be a Japanese edition of this book?
Yes.
Because I believe the impression I have about especially those the 90s and after, the younger generation, so to speak, even those women's works, our understanding, I mean, in Japan, I think, very atomized. You know this artist, that artist. Okay, I have 5 artists, I know, but who are they? Where they come, and also usually photo book doesn't really have the exegesis or explanation or accounts. It's picture book. And then so it's really important to historicize it, and I believe this book is doing that effort. So I really want to see Japanese edition.
Yeah.
It's easier for me to read that way too.
Yeah,
We
Mariko
also want to
Takeuchi,
see
yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
Mariko Takeuchi, who is, again, part of the editorial committee and the co-curator, is working very closely with a publisher now to adapt it.
Yeah, and the show will be in Tokyo, not
It's gonna
confirmed,
be
but will be
next
next
year.
summer, will be in Tokyo, so the book will come out for the show in Tokyo. Thank you.
Any other question?
I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I have a work-in-progress documentary called The Other Side of War, War Seen Through the Eyes of Children. And I'm wondering, isn't there anything on of war seen through the eyes of women? Because your starting point is in the mid-50s.
Yeah, no, so the portfolio started in the 50s, but the texts in the book do talk, and so one of the first photojournalists, photo documentary, was Sasamoto Tsuneko. Sasamoto is her last name. And so we talk about, in fact, Kelly McCormick and Carrie Cushman talk about her, you'll see in the book, in their essay. And in fact, throughout, so Ishiushi Miyako talks about Yokosuka, so that's pretty much. And in fact, one of her most famous photographs is this little girl in the street of Yokosuka that's almost like a self-portrait of herself growing up in that military base, not too far from Tokyo. So we do talk about it quite thoroughly in my essay. I talk about this, about how important it was to see the consequences of the war through the eyes of women and really the thoughts of women and the experiences of women. So we do talk about this quite.
Thank you.
And I would say that there are several themes that sort of are pervasive and get touched on through the many different lived experiences of the women photographers that we feature. The relationship, the very complex relationship between the United States and Japan is one of those themes that pops up in Ishikawa Mao's work, for example. Even in Ushioda Tokuko's work, there's these threads that...
And the fridges from the military army, I think. There's always even subtle details.
Anybody else? Any question? Yes.
Will you ever consider making another edition of this book, whether it be like expanding on this, like more female Japanese photographers, or some like in the 90s, or maybe like American Japanese female photographers?
I mean, I think we constructed this so it could serve as a foundation and open up this exploration to others. So I think we are happy to, if somebody else will continue this work.
I think it's kind of our responsibility to publish something like that at the Japanese end. So,
Yeah, by all means, yeah. We're hoping, that was the goal for this project, was to trigger a few ideas of other projects here in France, Europe, Japan, of course, Asia,
Two questions. One, you mentioned in passing some uneasiness about commercialization of the movement of the girl photography. So my question is sort of related to what extent would you say that some of the photographers are carrying out a critique of Japanese male photography, which is much more well known around the world and is actually very powerful. Everybody knows two or three certain male Japanese photographers. They're part of the worldwide canon. So to what extent is not a critique of, let's say, the industry, but actually of the aesthetics and approaches of these famous male photographers? And second, unrelated question, Zainichi Chosenjin, in the field of literature, Japanese Korean artists have been very important. I wonder if you have ever come across Zainichi Chosenjin photographers that are women.
Kim In-suk, yeah. So to respond to the second part, we spoke with Kim In-suk, who is one photographer, a woman photographer, so in my essay I discuss her, and in fact her whole body of work addresses the question of Zainichi and what it means, the many things that it means. Her work has been collected by the top museums, so we had many conversations about this also. What does Japanese women photographer mean? Can this include? And of course it was inclusive of Zainichi. The first part of your question was pretty much the incentive for this book, as far as I'm concerned, that in Japan, it's one thing, but in France, for instance, and being French, this was particularly striking to me, that when you say Japanese photography, people will immediately think black and white, contrasted, provoke, or araki being very well known in France because of the Fondation Cartier show. And it was important to me, this book was particularly important to me to add to that, because it's very diminishing of Japanese photography and of Japan in general to only see Japan through that lens that is very masculine. And again, I love Moriyama, so it's not a critique of what we know, but it was a mission that we had to add to that canon, to say, look, there's so many other things, there's so many other ways of looking at Japan and Japanese experiences. And so for us, this was very much the incentive. Some of those photographers, in fact, many of them worked with people like Araki and Moriyama. Tamiko Nishimura, whose book Russell talked about, was working with Moriyama in the darkroom, but there was no women in Provoke. So it was always this weird divide where they were adjacent, but not quite part of the same bubbles. There was no collective with women as there were with men. So that's also, that was very much why we wanted to.
But in the 70s, there were a few exhibitions that were curated by Ishuji Miyako that were specifically women to showcase their work. But it's true, the history as we know it in the West is the Provoke or the Vivo photographers. And I felt that way when I was starting to look at the books. No one was pulling out the photo books by women from Japan. And they were plentiful. So this book is a canon reshaping of what we need to look at when we think about Japanese photography in general.
And in terms of women directly speaking to the male gaze, there are, I mean, I think Nagashima Yurie really stands out as having written to these issues, having created her own work very much as a critique of this whole concept of the female subject of photography and the way in which she experienced that for herself. But there, in the exhibition, we did thematize the work where we don't in the book. And there is, I think, in the section of the exhibition on gender, you'll see there's a number of photographers who are really responding and making work that speaks to the way that photography has imposed certain ways of viewing the self, the body, the role of women.
Tomoko Sawada is another example, for instance, and that's what's part of the section, yeah.
Excellent question. Anybody else? Yes. Yes, sure.
Thank you all so much. You've touched on this a little bit in some other ways, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the selection process, because I'm sure it wasn't easy. And sort of how you know, there's certain big names that you certainly want to include, but what did that look like? What kinds of things were you thinking about? I'd love to just hear more about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, we had, when Pauline and I were putting this together, we each sort of had our favorites, certainly. But we did spend some time traveling and talking and just really accumulating the experiences that others who had been working in the field of photography in Japan, talking to photographers about who was important to them, and really compiling quite a massive list of potential contenders. Then looking at who within the structure of Japanese photography had been awarded prizes, who had had exhibitions, where they were. I mean, there were so many photographers that we did not feature. Of the 25, I think we had over 100 names to begin with. So really a process of discussion with our editorial committee too.
Right. We wanted it to be as representative of the range of styles and generations as possible, because some of them, you know, many of them, in 25 was excruciating, but it was good. We needed to restrict ourselves for the portfolios. But this is also why the bibliography was so important. And Mark and Russet and we, you know, with the committee, we were thinking about how do these two sections complement each other, and the essays. We have a lot of, so that you said, oh, well, we'll deal with that photographer with the books because she was a very important bookmaker, for instance. So in the end, I think it maybe is 80 photographers that we talk about, and we feel happy about that. 80 seems, but there are obviously hundreds, and so what we're very much hoping is that people will look at the essays, maybe scholars, maybe curators, and pick one that they really love and make a monograph of that. You know, so that was also our hope, is that this is not definitive, but this is as many as we could present in a thorough manner.
I also said Pauline and Lesley and the advisory editorial team shared with us the portfolios they were thinking about. So when Mark and I were selecting the illustrated bibliography, it was the opportunity to fill in some things that maybe, you know, they couldn't in the 25 portfolios that were, you know, very beautifully picked, but maybe there was, you know, a photographer who wanted to be showcased, and this was a chance to do that.
I've been seeing they're struggling to select.
Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe last question, quickly. Yes.
Okay. No, if you mentioned, maybe my question is very naive, but if you could explain a little bit of the difference between last century feminism over there compared to here.
Oh, that's a very long question.
Sayaka, can you answer this question?
It's totally different. And 今の日本のフェミニズムで私がちょっと心配しているのはポピュリズムがやっぱりある部分だからこう前に出て持ち上げられる人がいないと前に進まないところ。
Well, we already heard that it's totally different, but what she is worried about feminism more recently today is how it's becoming such a populist thing where unless you have the leader of the gang, the trailblazer that's marching forward, no one really moves. And it's like, it's not, you have to have an opinion leader for it to actually become a movement.
それからフェミニズム自体がすごく細かく枝分かれしてしまって彼ら自体がこうコンフリクトしている状況。
There's also this problem how feminism itself has so many little branches, so many little categories and ideas of each of them, and they kind of clash sometimes instead of moving together.
前の世代の方たちのことを詳しくは知らないけれども、彼女たちは私たちよりももっと厳しく家庭の中にいなければならなかったし、そういう意味ではもうちょっと団結していたのかなっていう気がします。一つのフェミニズムとして。
So this is just an assumption in terms of feminism from before, but I assume they had much more stricter societal conditions where they were really trapped in their homes. They couldn't go outside in terms of it was very difficult to be a housewife and be a feminist at the same time. So there's been much more constraints, but as a result, I feel like it must have been a much more consolidated movement as feminism.
So thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Miwa.